Smith.
I move that the question be now put.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I'm happy to take a call on this these amendments to the student loan scheme, but I want to start by responding to some of the comments from David Bennett. It's just, I just cannot let them go unanswered. But I want to start by saying it's somewhat ironic to be lectured by a government over there that has clocked up a bigger Crown debt than any other government in New Zealand's history. And they are lecturing us about debt repayment, and yet they have clocked up a bigger debt than any government in New Zealand's history that will take generations to repay. At the end of this parliamentary term, New Zealand will have more debt than we had at the end of Muldoon's term in government. And that's Bill English's legacy for New Zealand and John Key's legacy for New Zealand. Now, David Bennett talked about the people that really do the hard work, and then, of course, excluded anyone with a tertiary education from that definition. He basically said that if you've got a tertiary education in New Zealand, by definition, you're not one of the people that does the hard work and contributes to the New Zealand economy. You're not one of the socialist elite, no, you are one of the socialist elite if you have a tertiary education. That's just the typical anti-intellectual elitism, reverse elitism that we get from the national government, who hate anybody who might have an independent opinion, who might be able to think for themselves. Because, in fact, we don't even have a Prime Minister who can think for himself. He relies on Cameron Slater to tell him what he should think. And we know that for a fact because he admitted it the other day. Well, actually, I think perhaps if more New Zealanders had a tertiary education, they would be able to see through the hollow spin that so frequently comes from this national government. And they would know that having a government that's dictated to by Cameron Slater is not good for the health of the New Zealand democratic system. David Bennett seems to ignore the fact that we all benefit from an educated society. So yes, the people who don't get out a student loan because they may get their education through a trade, for example, they still benefit as part of a society from the people who do get a tertiary education. And this makes me part of the socialist elite by pointing out that somebody who doesn't have a tertiary education, but who might have a trades qualification, for example, that they've got through an apprenticeship. That's fantastic, but they still benefit from the contribution to society made by the people who do get a degree or take out a student loan in order to support their study. And of course, David Bennett ignores the fact that many tradespeople have student loans as well. Actually, many tradespeople have student loans as well. And so I think that David Bennett's anti-intellectualism doesn't contribute very much to this debate at all. Now, Mr Chair, I want to talk to the specific provisions in the bill, and in particular, what I'd like to do is examine the regulatory impact statement that the Treasury helpfully has released. And I thought it would be quite interesting because the regulatory impact statement is one of the cornerstones, one of the most useful resources that we get as parliamentarians, to look at the options that were canvassed by government, to look at the pros and cons of each option and the reasons why they chose one option or the other, and to be able to weigh up the legislation before the House in light of the other alternatives available. And so I was interested to see what the pros and cons were, for example, of the arrest at the border provisions in this. Somewhat helpfully, the Treasury have redacted all of the analysis of the pros and cons of that particular provision, which begs the question, of course, what on earth is the point of a regulatory impact statement that actually is supposed to inform intelligent debate on a bill if it's all redacted, if it's all withheld from the people who are actually going to be taking part in the debate? It actually means that the regulatory impact statement is worse than useless, and we have to ask the question, what, of course, is the point? But moving now, unfortunately, I can't canvass really in any great details the pros and cons of the alternatives that were considered by government because the Treasury hasn't supplied them. It could well be, of course, that the government didn't consider any alternatives, because we know, in fact, this is a fairly hollow measure. It's not exactly going to suddenly result in a massive decrease in student loan borrowing or student loan debt. In fact, it will have negligible impact. This is more that the government want to be seen to be doing something about something. They just, it fills up the legislative program, makes them look busy. It doesn't really make a heck of a lot of difference, but it makes them look busy, makes them look tough on all those mean nasty people who don't repay their student loans. And of course we know that there's actually very few people in that category. But I was very interested in looking at clauses 10 and 11 of this bill, which deal with the sharing of contact details of borrowers received from their, Mr. Chair.
Chris Hipkins.
Received from their passport renewals. Because at the moment, under the current arrangement, for example, if somebody applies for a passport, the IRD can obtain the contact details they supply with their passport application only if they are in default on their student loan. This provision extends to everyone, even if they're not in default on their student loan. But I actually think that there's a very legitimate question to ask about this. Why would the IRD have the right to obtain somebody's passport application details if they're not in default, if they've done nothing wrong? What right does that give the Inland Revenue to obtain their personal private information? I don't think it does. I don't think that there's any good reason for doing that. There's no case. I've read the regulatory impact statement. I've read this little document here, that the commentary on the bill that Todd McClay, the Minister of Revenue, has put out, and the case has not really been made at all as to why it is that somebody who has done nothing wrong, who has made all of the student loan repayments that they're required to make and applies for a passport because they want to go away on holiday. What right does the government have to give that information that is submitted for a passport application, give it to the IRD for the purposes of student loan administration when that person's done nothing wrong? Their repayments are all up to date. There's actually no good reason for that. No case is made for that. This is just a case of the government sharing people's information willy-nilly. They may as well give it to the ACC and then everybody could have it. Or just give it to Judith Collins or Cameron Slater, and then he could publish it, and then John Key would know what everybody's up to, of course, because we know that that's one of the main channels of information that John Key has. Actually, no case is made for this information sharing. Now, I think that government departments should share information where there is good reason to do so. There is no good reason for sharing this information in the cases where people aren't in default on their loans. If they're meeting all of their repayment obligations, the government should just leave them alone. And as long as they continue to do so, good on them. And I don't think the government has any right to be delving into their private personal passport applications. So I want to come now to the arrest at the border provisions, because I think one of the really important messages that we want to send to student loan borrowers who are living overseas is we want you to come home. We do want you to come home. We want you to contribute to New Zealand society. You are valued members of New Zealand society, and we want to make it as easy as possible for you to come back. But of course what this government have done is, first of all, they've made it more likely for people who are away overseas to get into default in the first place. Previously there was an amnesty or a holiday period from repayment. Given a holiday period, when those who went away on their OE, for example, they might go overseas and they might take 18 months off. That was fine. This government have reduced that so that now someone who's away for 18 months overseas, people might go away on an OE for a year, and then of course things happen. Things happen while people are away on the OEs, and they extend it. And they might extend it for 18 months, to 18 months or 2 years. Suddenly, without ever having really thought about it before they left home, because they were only ever intending to be away for a year, suddenly they'll find themselves in default of their student loan repayments. And it's not something that, if most graduates, if they're going away for a year on their OE, and many do, and I'd actually encourage them to do it because I think they're better contributors to the New Zealand society when they get back. And that sense of perspective that somebody gets from travel is good for New Zealand. So I'd encourage them to do that, and they go away for a year and they don't really think, what about my student loan? And nor should they really need to, because if they're only away for a year, then there are no penalties for non-repayment while they're away for a year. Previously that was 3 years, and it did allow for those situations. Now of course I don't know what the overall experience of members of the House is, but most of the people I know who go away overseas for a period of time, they're normally back within a couple of years. They go away, they might do a bit of a working holiday, they do a bit of an OE, but they then do come back, and when they come back they start repaying their student loans. Now these are the people who are going to be captured by this government's somewhat draconian and punitive measures. And what it does is it sends a message to them that New Zealand doesn't want them back. Actually, we do want them back. We do want to make it possible for people at the end of their study, or at some point they might have worked for a few years to save some money beforehand. We do want to make it possible for them to travel overseas, and then we want to make it as easy as possible for them to come back. Not this government. This government don't seem to be interested in that. So I think It's window dressing, this bill, but it's actually sending the wrong messages in its window dressing. Yes, people should repay their student loans, but simply being punitive about it and threatening to arrest people at the border is not a progressive, forward-looking move. It's actually quite retrograde, and that's one of the reasons why the Labour Party is opposing the bill.
Alfred Naro.
I move